Welcome, folks, to Arthurian April, day 28, and I got that right this time. Today we are talking about nothing so great, so mysterious, so strange. We're talking about the Holy Grail. Now, I have to admit, the Holy Grail has never been something that particularly captured my imagination outside of the Monty Python and the Holy Grail, but it is rather interesting. And like most Arthurian authors, I put my own twist on it. So let us go back in time and find out how the Holy Grail happened, what the heck a Grail is, and what it means for the larger story of King Arthur. You probably know what I'm going to say next. Where do you think we're going? Oh yes, we're going to the 12th century and we're going to Chrétien de Troyes. So his Percival story is not finished, which we talked about in the episode about Chrétien. And toward the end of it, which again, not finished, he describes a scene in which Percival is at a castle, at a feast, and Grail maidens or some kind of lovely ladies appear carrying grails as well as other holy relics. It's not really given a lot of detail. In fact, most stories that follow this refer to the Grail as the Grail. Linguistically, it's possible it means a sort of vessel, a drinking vessel, but it's a little obscure, and linguistics folks have had many more arguments about it than I'm willing to go into this evening. In the Percival tale, it's not just a grail, but it's also 2 candelabrum and a bleeding lance, so a lance that is excreting blood. Eventually, one thing comes to another, and one of the major themes of the later part of the Arthurian tale is the quest for the Grail. It is this sort of obsessive desire for the Knights of the Round Table to go out and find this miraculous Grail, which could potentially be healing or powerful or just magic or interesting. And many of them perish in the seeking of it. And many are judged not worthy enough. And this is really where the story has this sort of confluence of mythology and Christian mythology. Because according to I think it's the Suite de Merlin, which is one of the first times where they kind of expand on this myth, the Grail itself is the chalice that Joseph of Arimathea had in his hands to collect the blood of Christ on the cross, and it was also the vessel that he drank from during the Last Supper. Of course, these stories are not happening until the 13th century, so there's a significant lag time between when these items might have even come into the collective consciousness and when these stories are actually being told. And it's highly unlikely that people were collecting these things and saving them. But it's really not surprising that the idea of relics being powerful is a theme that shows up in King Arthur. Because remember, the height of Arthurian stories is also concurrent with the height of the Crusades. And going into the purported Holy Land and getting your hands on all kinds of interesting pieces of purported saints and shrouds and cups and things, I mean, there was money to be made. And so many churches in that period and after were built around very special relics that were sort of central to the way that they could get people to come visit the church, right? You had the finger bone of Saint Priscilla, and people would come from miles and miles around just to sit and think about it and meditate and pray and all of that. We are fairly sure that there are Celtic precedents to the Holy Grail, that there are implements of great power. There are similar sort of things mentioned in the triads of the Welsh triads. So, you've probably read fantasy before. The idea of items that are kind of infused with magic, that are special, that's nothing really new. But whether or not there's an exact analog to the Celtic lore, it's kind of up for debate. I read a really interesting article doing research for today's episode that connected the Grail to actual heads. And I mean, we've talked about heads already, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. There are a lot of heads and beheading that are in these stories, kind of more than you would expect on average. Apparently in Percivalis, there's 152 different severed heads, which seems like a lot of heads, just a very, very high number for any of these stories. And there is some argument that some Celtic groups would carry around severed heads as sort of trophies for the work that they did. And it's potentially thought that in some ways the Grail is related to that, that they do hold some kind of power. And obviously there are many examples of people being able to drink out of a skull, right? Skull can double as a kind of drinking vessel. It's wonderfully macabre. I don't know that I really buy it 100%, but I do like the thesis of the article, which is that we kind of can't trace this back to an exact like, because it's very unlikely that the people who were writing and reading and telling these stories had any clear understanding of severed head tradition. But the symbolism and the sort of iconography of the period absolutely transferred hundreds of years past when something like carrying around your severed heads was relatively normal. I feel like we've gone slightly off topic here, but you know. Suffice it to say, there's also a castle where the Grail is, which is owned by the Fisher King. And if you're familiar with Fisher King mythologies, he is usually a king who is sick in some capacity and must be healed so the land can be healed. There are also typically 3 knights that attain the Grail, those being Galahad, Percival, and Bors. Sometimes Percival dies on the way back, but I think close to 100 knights die in pursuit of the Grail, which of course means that when Civil War happens and the whole Lancelot situation occurs, there are a lot fewer people around to help on either side. I always find it kind of ironic that the Grail quest sort of symbolizes the end of this golden era. And in a lot of ways, that reminds me of how the Crusades started to begin with, right? This idea that most of the local strife was over and they had to go somewhere else to basically get out their energy and figure out what the next adventure was. And of course, it was bloody and horrible and disgusting. But it did change everything afterwards. So I always kind of wonder if there's a little bit of a connection there. In my stories, the Grails, because there's 3 of them, they represent not just 3 Grails, but 3 kinds of magic and 3 kind of concepts. So one is pain, one is joy, and one is peace. And joy, peace, and pain are an important theme in the story that Guinevere, the sister of Weefar, talks a lot about in her sort of own, she's an ex-priestess who's kind of with her head in the clouds, but has rather profound things to say. The idea being that this is not a scale of good and evil, but it's a scale of sort of human experience. Peace being in the middle, this neutral, pain being, the strife, and joy being on the other side of that. Pain is the cup. Joy is the shield, which is also a plate or a platter. And the spear itself is peace. My Grail Maiden is a queen named Weefar, and when she holds the spear, this is what she has to say. With this Grail implement in my hand, I could sunder the connection between the Green Knight and myself. In a moment, I could end its suffering or not. I could leave the scene to play itself out. Weefar could cease to exist in the story. All that would remain was Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, whether he lived or died. The mirror, the path, was before me. There was no escape.